Jeremiah Finch slammed the leather satchel onto the pulpit, so hard the whole church shook. $43, he said, loud enough for every person in the room to hear. That's what Calvin Caldwell owes me. $43 and 6 months of lies. He turned slowly, letting his eyes move across the pews, making sure nobody missed what came next. Then he grabbed Clementine by the wrist and pulled her forward, yanked her. Really, the way a man yanks a stubborn mule out of a stall, and held her arm up like he was displaying livestock at auction. Since he can't pay in coin, he'll pay in kind. The laughter started in the back. It always started in the back. If you were sitting in that church on the 3rd Sunday of October, 1878, in the town of Oak Haven, Colorado Territory, you would have seen something that should have shamed every soul in those pews. Instead, most of them were smiling. This story is about what happened next. Stay with me to the end, because what this woman does in the coming months will change everything you think you know about strength. This is your first time here. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that church. Clementine Caldwell was 26 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning how to make herself small. Not small in the way a shy woman makes herself small, quiet in corners, eyes down at supper. Small in a different way. The kind of small you learn when the world spends enough years telling you that you take up too much space, that your shoulders are too wide, that your hands are too large, your laugh is too loud, and your stride is too long, and your face is not the kind of face that men write poems about. She had learned it young. The girls at school had taught her first, then the boys, then the grown women at the general store who would look at her mother and say, in voices they didn't bother to lower, "What a shame about the oldest one." Her mother, God rest her, had tried to counter it, had called Clementine capable and strong and worth 10 of those girls. But her mother had been dead 11 years now, and the words of dead women fade faster than people admit. What remained was her father's voice, Calvin Caldwell, a man who smelled of bad whiskey before noon, and who had spent the last decade treating his eldest daughter less like a child and more like a solution to problems he kept creating. When the debts came, and they always came, because Calvin was the kind of man who borrowed money with the confidence of someone who had never once intended to pay it back, he would look at Clementine with a particular expression. Not quite guilt, not quite shame, something closer to calculation. She had seen that expression 3 days before the scene in the church. He hadn't told her what he'd arranged. He'd only said she needed to put on her good dress Sunday morning and come to service early. She'd ask why. He'd looked away. That was when she knew something was wrong. But she had spent so long trusting her father's silences that she walked into that church and sat in the 3rd pew from the front and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Jeremiah Finch walked in 7 minutes after the congregation settled. He was a compact man, the kind who wore his wealth in every visible inch-pressed wool coat, gold watch chain, hair so precisely parted, it looked drawn on with a pen. He was 41 years old and had been the primary lender in Oak Haven for 9 years, which meant that roughly 1/3 of the families in that church owed him something. He knew it. More importantly, he made sure they knew he knew it. He moved through town with the ease of a man who understood that money in a frontier settlement was a form of power so complete it functioned as its own law. He walked to the pulpit without asking permission. Preacher, a thin, uncertain man named Brother Aldous, stepped aside without protest. Finch set the satchel down. He explained the debt in numbers and dates, and the kind of precise financial language designed not to inform but to humiliate. $43, 6 months, 4 written notices ignored, and then he grabbed Clementine's wrist. Her first instinct, the instinct she'd spent 26 years training, was to go still. Don't fight. Don't make it worse. The way an animal goes quiet when it knows the trap has already closed. But something in the way he lifted her arm, that casual, contemptuous lift, like she was a bolt of cloth. He was demonstrating the weight of cracked something open inside her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something rawer, something that had no name but felt like the moment right before anger, when your body understands what's happening before your mind is willing to. He looked out at the congregation. Mrs. Hargrove, from the millinery, was pressing her lips together to hide a smile. The Danby brothers were not hiding theirs at all. Old Pete Sutter, who had bounced her on his knee when she was 4 years old, was studying the floor. Her father was in the back pew with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere above the window. At nothing. At the place men look when they've done something they'd like not to have witnessed. "She's a good, strong girl," Finch said, still holding her arm up. "She'll work hard. She can cook. She can haul. She's not much to look at, but then Caldwell never was going to give me something pretty." He paused for the laugh. He got it. "I'll take her wages for 2 years against the debt, and we'll call it settled." Clementine finally found her voice. "I am not property," she said. Came out quieter than she meant it to. But the church was quiet enough that everyone heard. Finch looked at her, the way men look at animals that have made an unexpected sound. Amused and faintly annoyed. "No one asked your opinion, girl?" "I am not a girl." She pulled her arm back. He let her. Because the fight wasn't one he needed to win, he already had the crowd. "I am a grown woman, and you cannot auction me in a church. Father signs off." "My father signed nothing that belongs to him." Her voice was shaking now, and she hated that, but she couldn't stop it. "I am not his to sign, Clementine." That was her father's voice from the back. Low. Warning. The voice that had always meant, "Stop. You are making it worse. You are embarrassing me." She turned to look at him, full on. The way she had never been brave enough to look at him before. "Don't," she said. Just that. One word. The church was very quiet, and then the doors opened. She would think about those doors for years afterward. The way the October light came through them, first sharp and cold and horizontal. The kind of light that only exists in mountain mornings. And then the shadow inside the light. Gideon Hayes was not a man you forgot after seeing once. He was 6 feet and 3 inches of mountain living, which meant he was not merely tall but structured differently than the men in that church, broader through the shoulders than a doorframe, with hands that looked like they'd been carved rather than grown. He was somewhere past 40, though the years had been the kind that add weight and presence rather than the kind that diminish. There was a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to the corner of his jaw, an old one, pale and long, the kind that comes from something with teeth. His coat was heavy canvas, and his boots had never been polished in their lives, and he had not shaved in what appeared to be at least 2 weeks. He smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and cold air. He looked at no one when he entered. He walked up the center aisle with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had thought carefully about what he was about to do and had made his peace with it. He reached the pulpit and he set down a small pouch. It landed on the wood with the distinct heavy sound of gold coin. "It's owed," he said. He was talking to Finch. Finch stared at him. "Hayes." "Finch, this is none of your affair." Counted $43.20 in there. Gideon's voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that doesn't need to be. "That cover it?" Something shifted in Finch's face. The amusement dropped out of it and left something harder underneath. "You don't know what you're—" "I know exactly what I'm doing." Gideon looked at Clementine for the first time. It was not the look she expected. It was not pity. It was not the long assessing look she'd gotten all her life from men who were tallying her deficiencies. It was the look of a man who was being straightforward about something. Practical. Direct. "Miss Caldwell, I've got a ranch at Whisper Ridge. Been working it alone for 4 years. I could use someone capable." He paused. "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me." The silence in that church was total. Clementine stared at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "You don't know anything about me. I know Finch was holding your arm up, like you were something he'd shot." He glanced at the pouch. "And I know you told him you weren't property." "Which is true." He looked back at her. "That's enough for me to start with." She should have felt something complicated at that moment, hope or fear or gratitude muddled up with suspicion, and she did feel all of those things, in a kind of roaring, undifferentiated rush. But underneath them was something simpler. She looked at her father. He was still holding his hat. He had not moved from the back pew. She looked at Jeremiah Finch, whose face had gone the particular color of a man who has lost control of his own theater. She looked at the congregation, at Mrs. Hargrove and the Danby brothers and old Pete Sutter and all the rest of them. Every person who had spent years enjoying the particular entertainment of her humiliation. Then she looked at Gideon Hayes. "All right," she said. They were married that afternoon, in the same church, with Brother Aldous officiating, and exactly no guests who had been invited. Gideon had a ring, a plain silver band, nothing remarkable that he produced from his coat pocket like he'd been carrying it for other purposes and was repurposing it on short notice. Later, she would learn that he'd ridden into town with it, that he had, in fact, planned this in his particular way. But that was later. In the immediate aftermath, while Brother Aldous was still closing his book, Jeremiah Finch came to stand in front of Gideon with the specific posture of a man preparing to make a threat. "You understand," Finch said quietly, "that this isn't finished." "Figured," Gideon said. "I've got interests in this county that run deeper than you know, Hayes. Deeper than that ridge you've been hiding on for 4 years. Gideon picked up his hat from the pew. He was not a man who performed anger. There was no jaw tightening, no squaring of shoulders. He just looked at Finch with the same direct, undecorated attention he'd given everything else in the past hour. "Then come up the mountain and tell me about them," he said, and he walked out. Clementine followed him. She had one bag. She had packed it that morning, out of habit. She always kept a bag half-packed, in the way of people who have spent their lives waiting for the moment they'd need to leave somewhere quickly. It held 3 dresses, her mother's hairbrush, a packet of dried herbs, and a folding knife her uncle had given her years ago and never asked back for. It was not much, but then she had never owned much that she would miss. Outside the church, Gideon had a wagon and 2 draft horses, names she would learn their names before nightfall, Pocket, and Ruin. The horses were enormous and patient, and clearly well kept, which told her something she filed away without comment. He loaded her bag without being asked. Then he climbed up to the driver's seat and waited. She stood at the church steps for a moment. Behind her, through the closed doors, she could hear voices starting up again. The sound of Oakhaven resuming its normal operations. She had lived 26 years in this town, and it was already moving on from her. She thought about her father, still sitting in the back pew with his hat in his hands. She thought about her mother. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "I don't know anything about you either," she said. "That's fair," Gideon said. He clicked his tongue, and Pocket and Ruin started forward. "I'll need to," she said. "In time." "In time," he agreed. The wagon rolled north out of Oakhaven. The mountain road ahead was narrow and steep, and the light had gone the color of cold iron. Clementine did not look back. She had spent enough of her life looking at things that had already decided they didn't want her. But she did notice. She noticed everything. It was one of her habits. The habit of someone who had always needed to read rooms, quickly, that Gideon Hayes drove with the reins loose in his hands, and his back straight, and his eyes on the road ahead with the specific calm of a man who had made a difficult decision and was not second-guessing it. She didn't know yet whether that was admirable or frightening. She suspected it might be both. The horses were strong. The mountain rose ahead of them, and the town of Oakhaven shrank behind them with every turn of the wheels until it was gone. And Clementine Caldwell, Clementine Hayes, now, by law, if not yet, by anything else, kept her eyes forward, and her hands in her lap, and breathed the cold October air, and tried to figure out what exactly she had just walked into. She was afraid. That was honest. She was also buried underneath the fear like a coal under ash. Something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it. She was curious. The road to Whisper Ridge took 4 hours in good weather. This was not good weather. The sky had been closing in since they left Oakhaven, not dramatically, not with the kind of theatrical storm clouds that announce themselves, but in the quiet, incremental way of mountain weather, which doesn't care whether you're ready for it. By the time they were 2 hours out, the temperature had dropped enough that Clementine could see her breath, and the wind coming down off the upper elevations had a particular edge to it, kind that finds the gaps in your coat and works through them methodically. She did not complain. She had learned young that complaining about cold was its own kind of weakness, not because toughness was a virtue her father had ever modeled, but because complaining changed nothing about the temperature and only made the people around you tired of your company. Gideon said nothing for the first hour. This was not an uncomfortable silence, which surprised her. She had expected it to be, had expected to spend the ride cataloging all the ways this had been a catastrophic decision, all the things she didn't know about this man, all the ways this could go wrong, and she did catalog them. But the silence itself wasn't oppressive. Gideon drove the way he did everything she'd observed so far, which was with a kind of settled attention, not distracted and not performing, just present. It was so different from her father's silences, which had always been loaded with things unsaid and moods unpredictable, that she kept waiting for the other shoe. It didn't drop. Around the second hour, when the wagon had climbed high enough that the pines closed overhead, and the road became a series of switchbacks cut into the slope, he spoke. "Cold? I'm fine." He reached behind the seat without looking and pulled out a folded wool blanket. He held it out to her. She took it. "Thank you." "There's another one if that's not enough." She unfolded it across her lap and her legs, and she was, immediately, significantly warmer. She had too much pride to say so. "Pocket and Ruin," she said, after another quarter mile. "Those names mean anything?" He thought about it. Pocket. Because when I first got her, she had this habit of putting her nose into every coat pocket she could reach, looking for something sweet. He paused. Never found anything. Still looks. "And Ruin? That's what the man I bought him from said his life would be if he sold him. Said he'd ruin him for it." He didn't elaborate on whether that had proven true. Clementine looked at the back of Ruin's head, a large, dark, patient animal with ears that moved independently, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. Did it? Ruin him? Man bought a bottle of whiskey with the money and drank it alone in his barn. Gideon's voice was flat, not judgmental, just factual. So probably. She didn't laugh, but something shifted in her chest that was adjacent to it. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "Another 2 hours. Maybe less if the upper road hasn't washed." "Has it?" "Probably not. It was dry in September." She pulled the blanket tighter. "You ride into Oakhaven often?" "No. But you knew about the debt." A pause. "I knew about Finch," he said. "Man like that, you keep track of. He's been moving on property in this county for 3 years. Buying up debt, calling it in when he knows people can't pay, then acquiring the land at half its value. He guided the horses through a tight curve without slowing. I've been watching him work his way toward the ridge. This reoriented the entire morning in her mind. You came to town today because of Finch, not because of me. I came because Finch was going to make a move I'd heard about, he said. Didn't know it would involve you, but once it did. He was quiet for a moment. Once it did, it seemed like a problem that could be solved 2 ways at once. She stared at the road ahead. 2 problems solved at once. She supposed she ought to feel something about being one half of an equation, but the honesty of it was such a relief after a lifetime of people pretending their motives were simpler than they were that she found she didn't mind it. What do you get out of it? She asked. Out of marrying me. Someone capable at the ranch. You could have hired someone capable. Could have, he agreed, but hired hands leave. And there are other complications with a hired hand. He didn't specify what those complications were, but she understood he meant the kind that came from a man living alone in an isolated place, with a woman he wasn't married to, and the talk that would generate in a county where talk could cost you contracts and credit and goodwill. What are you not telling me? She asked. He glanced at her for the first time since they'd left town, just briefly, then back to the road. Quite a few things, he said. but nothing that's meant to deceive you. Just things I'll tell you when there's time to tell them right." She considered this. "Is any of it dangerous? To you?" "Yes." "No," he said, and she believed him, which was itself a strange experience. She had learned to disbelieve most assurances from men as a matter of survival. But there was something in his voice that was not the tone of a man managing her. It was the tone of a man answering a direct question directly. She settled back. The blanket was warm. The horses moved steadily. Above the tree line, the first pale shapes of high peaks appeared between gaps in the cloud. She had made the most reckless decision of her life in the last 4 hours. Strangely, she was not yet regretting it. The house was not what she expected. She had built picture in her mind on the ride up, a picture assembled from what she knew of men who lived alone in the mountains for years, which was minimal, dirty, functional in the way that things are functional, when no one has thought about comfort since the last woman left. She had expected gaps in the thinking, the way places get when they've been arranged by pure utility, without anyone asking whether it might be arranged any other way. What she found was a house that someone had cared about. It was built of pine and stone, low and solid, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. Porch roof was in good repair. The windows were small but clean. Inside which she entered cautiously behind Gideon, the main room had a stone fireplace on the east wall that had been laid with actual craft, the stones fitted and mortared by someone who had taken time over it, not just stacked. There were 2 chairs and a table and a shelf of tools along the south wall, and a small separate kitchen with a cast iron stove that was cold now, but recently used, the ashes still pale. It was not decorated, but it was ordered. Things were where they were for reasons. "Bedroom's through there," Gideon said, pointing to a door off the main room. "I'll sleep in the tack room off the barn until we figure out how this is going to work." "It's not necessary, it is," he said, not unkindly. "Don't know me. I don't expect you to share a room with a man you met 6 hours ago. That's not what I brought you here for." She stood in the middle of the main room and looked around carefully. "Built this," she said. "Most of it. The foundation was already here when I bought the claim. But the rest. How long did it take?" 2 years of working it alongside everything else. He set her bag down near the bedroom door. "There's firewood on the porch. I'll get a fire going." She stopped him. "I can do it." He paused. "I know how to lay a fire," she said. "I've been doing it since I was 9. "I know you do." "I'm not." He stopped. Started again. "All right." She laid the fire. He watched from across the room, not hovering, just present, and she was aware of him watching, and she did it right, the way her mother had taught her, kindling low and dry, airspace between the larger pieces, catching flame on the first try. The warmth started almost immediately, spreading out from the stone hearth into the cold room. Straightened up. Something passed across Gideon's face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. "I'll see to the horses," he said. First week was a careful, deliberate negotiation conducted almost entirely in actions. They talked, but not constantly, not the way people in close quarters sometimes overtalk to fill the discomfort. They established through trial and error, and the occasional short, terse exchange, how the household worked and who did what parts of it. Clementine took over the kitchen entirely, within 2 days, not by declaring it, but by simply being better at it than him, which he acknowledged without embarrassment, which she appreciated. She organized the shelves, which had been arranged by the logic of a man who put things where he'd last been standing when he set them down, and reorganized them by function and frequency of use. Gideon watched this happen and said nothing except, at the end of the second day, "I can find things now." "Good," she said. The outside work was different. She was not strong in the way. Mountain men meant strength. She could not lift what he could lift, could not swing an axe with his force or efficiency. But she was not weak either, and she'd always been aware that the particular strength she had, which was physical endurance and a high tolerance for sustained labor, was the kind that people tended not to see in women because they weren't looking for it. She helped with the animals on the fourth morning, the 2 draft horses and 3 riding horses and a small herd of cattle that Gideon ran on the upper pasture. She worked beside him in the barn without being told what to do, watching once and then doing it, and she felt his attention shift at some point, felt the quality of it change from monitoring to something more like she didn't have a word for it then, consideration. On the 5th day she asked him about the scar. They were at the table after supper, salt pork and beans and cornbread she'd made, which was better than it should have been given, that the pantry was a man's pantry and lacked several things she'd have liked, and the fire was going, and the wind was loud outside, and it was the most. She'd felt almost comfortable since she'd arrived. The scar, she said, on your face. He touched it reflexively. Mountain lion. Years back. How many years? 7. That's a big cat to survive. I had a rifle, he said. She had a set of cubs about 50 yards up the slope. I came around a boulder and surprised her. He paused. Neither of us wanted what happened next. You killed her? He was quiet a moment. Felt bad about it. Took the cubs down to a trapper I knew who'd raised orphaned cats before. Don't know what became of them. She thought about a man who felt bad about killing an animal that had almost killed him, who transported the orphaned cubs to someone who knew how to care for them. She filed this away. What happened 7 years ago that brought you up here? She asked. Up to the ridge. His face didn't change, exactly, but the quality of his stillness did. That's one of the things I said I'd tell you, when there was time to tell it right, he said. Is now not right? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he set down his fork and folded his hands on the table and looked at the fire. I had a wife, he said, in Kansas. Clara. He said the name like it had weight he was careful about carrying. We had a son. He lived 3 days. Clara afterward, there were complications. The doctor said she survived, but she couldn't. He stopped. She couldn't have more children. And something went out of her, after. Something I didn't know how to reach. She left 2 years later. Went back east to her family. We weren't. It wasn't angry, just done. Clementine was quiet. The injury the birth caused, it was the same for me, he said. The doctor in Kansas told me afterward I'd not be likely to father children either. He said this the way he said most things plainly, without theater, but she could hear the cost of it under the plainness. That's something you needed to know before things go any further than they are. She looked at him across the table. How long have you been up here alone? She asked, after she left. 4 years. 4 years, she repeated. Yes. She thought about that. 4 years in the mountains alone. Not as punishment, she understood enough about him now to know it wasn't self-pity that drove him up here. It was more like recalibration. The decision of a man who had decided he would rather build something that was honest and durable than stay in a life that had stopped fitting. I'm not, she started, then stopped, then tried again. I didn't come up this mountain because I wanted children. I came up because the alternative was Jeremiah Finch making decisions about where I worked, and for how long. She held his gaze. And because it was the first time in my life someone stood up in front of other people and said I was worth standing up for, even if the reasons were practical. He looked at her for a long moment. They were partly practical, he said, which was different from saying they were entirely practical. She didn't push it. She picked up her fork. The second week, it snowed. Not a gentle snow, the kind that makes a place look like a painting and then melts before noon. This was a proper early winter storm, the kind the Rockies produce in November as a kind of announcement, as if the mountains are clarifying what they expect from you before things get serious. 2 feet fell in 18 hours. The upper pasture disappeared. Barn door had to be dug out from the inside. Gideon and Clementine worked side by side for 6 hours, moving through it, tending the animals, breaking ice on the water troughs, getting hay to the cattle, reinforcing the weak section of the north fence that he'd been meaning to fix since September and now had no choice about. She worked without complaint, which he noticed, and without pretending it wasn't hard, which he also noticed. At some point in the early afternoon, waist deep in a drift alongside the fence, She stopped and stood up straight and put her hands on her lower back and said, I am going to need the feeling in my feet back before I can do that next section. Come on then, he said, and led her back to the house. He made his coffee, which was strong enough to argue with, and she sat at the table, with her hands wrapped around the cup and her boots off, drying her feet by the fire, with an expression of pure unself-conscious relief. He sat across from her. Outside, the wind hammered at the shutters. You're from here? She asked. Colorado? Tennessee, originally. Moved west at 19. He drank his coffee. You? Born in Oakhaven, she said. Never left before today. Yesterday. She did the calculation. It had been almost 2 weeks now. She lost track. Before the wedding, never? My mother was sick for years before she died. After my father needed, I was the one who stayed. She said it without bitterness, but also without cleaning it up into something noble. It was what it was. He needed someone to manage the house and run the errands and keep the accounts because he was not capable of doing it himself. And I was the oldest, and no one was there. Was no one offering to take me away from it? Gideon was quiet. Did you want to go? He asked. She looked at the fire. I used to think about California, she said. When I was younger, I had a book about it, the coast, the valleys, the kind of land where you could grow anything. I used to think about it the way you think about things you know are impossible, just to have something to think about. She paused. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because I asked, he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular attention of his, the kind that felt like it cost him something, like he wasn't a man who gave it easily, but he was giving it now. You're a strange man, Gideon Hayes, she said. I've been told. I don't mean it badly. I know. He refilled his cup. You're a strange woman, Clementine Hayes. Not many people would have done what you did this morning in a snowdrift. What did I do? Worked alongside, he said it simply. A lot of people work around. You work alongside of me. She didn't know what to do with that. It was the most specific compliment anyone had paid her in years, and it was about digging fence posts in 2 feet of snow, and somehow it landed harder than anything more ornate would have. She looked back at the fire. My mother told me once, she said, that the only opinion of yourself worth trusting is the one built from what you've actually done, not what people say, not what you feel about yourself, what you've actually done with your actual hands on actual days. She paused. I've been trying to believe her for 11 years. Gideon said nothing, but when she looked over, he was still looking at her, and his expression had the quality of a man who has heard something that rang true against something in himself. The weeks continued to accumulate, one against another, in the way that time moves in isolated places, slowly when you're in it, suddenly fast when you look back. She learned the land. She could navigate the 2 main trails off the property without guidance. She knew which creek ran reliable through hard freeze and which one didn't. She knew where the cattle pushed south when the north wind came and how far they would push before they needed driving back. She learned this the way she learned most things, by watching, then by doing, then by making the particular kind of mistake that is educational rather than catastrophic. Gideon taught her to use his rifle. This happened not through formal instruction, but through an afternoon when she'd watched him sight a shot at a coyote circling the hen enclosure, and she'd said without preamble, "Show me how that works." He had looked at her for a moment. Then he'd handed her the rifle. She was not a natural shot. She understood this immediately. Without drama, she had decent hands and reasonable spatial sense, but she'd never fired before, and the mechanics of it were unfamiliar, the weight and the kick and the adjustment of breathing. She missed the first 4 shots by margins that started wide and narrowed. Gideon stood behind her and to the right, making corrections to her stance that were practical and impersonal. Shoulder. Here, not here, elbow down, and the 5th shot hit the base of the pine she was using as a target. She lowered the rifle. That's not nothing, he said. It's not enough, no, but it's where you start. He took the rifle back. We'll do it again tomorrow. They did it again the next day, and the day after, and within 2 weeks, she was reliable enough at 50 yards. that he gave her one of the shorter rifles from the cabinet and told her to keep it close when she was working outside, alone. She understood what that meant. She understood it wasn't casual. "You're expecting trouble," she said. "I'm expecting Finch," he said, which is the same thing. She'd been waiting for this conversation. "Tell me what he wants." Gideon sat down on the porch step. The afternoon was cold but clear, one of those winter days that are beautiful, in a way that feels like a warning. 50 acres on the south side of my property line go right down to the valley road, he said. "You control that 60 acres. You control the only reliable wagon access between the high ranches and the territorial road north. That's freight money, toll money, and eventually, if the railroad comes through the way they're saying, that's right-of-way money." He paused. "Finch has been buying claims around that 60 acres for 2 years. He needs mine to complete the picture, and he can't buy it. I won't sell, so he needs to take it." "Yes. How?" "He'll find a way to manufacture a debt or a legal dispute. He's done it before. There's a family named Greer down in the valley lost their water rights because Finch produced a document none of them ever signed, or signed without understanding what they were signing. By the time anyone got a lawyer's attention, the deed was transferred and the Greers were tenant farming their own land." Clementine thought about this. "He'll come." "Yes." "When?" "Spring, probably. Winter buys time." He looked out at the mountains, but not forever. She sat down beside him on the porch step. Not close, there was still that careful distance between them that they'd maintained without discussion. Beside him. "You have documentation?" she asked. "For the property, original deed, survey markers, 7 years of tax receipts." "Where are they?" "Lockbox in the tack room." "Move them," she said. "Something happens to the barn, you lose everything. Put them in the house, double wrapped in oilcloth." She paused. "And get copies made if you haven't. Send them to the county seat, to a lawyer you trust, somewhere Finch can't reach." He turned to look at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at the mountains. "You're right. I know I'm right." She stood up. "I'll start supper." She was at the door when he spoke. "Clementine," she turned. He was still looking at the mountains. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly so it doesn't come out wrong." He stopped, started again. "I brought you up here for practical reasons, mostly, and I told you that, which I think was the right thing to do. These weeks," he stopped again. He was not a man who found this kind of language easy. She could see him working for it, the way you work, for something that doesn't come naturally. "I want you to know that I see you, not what I thought I'd find, actually here. And it's more than I stood in the doorway for a moment. "That's the most words I've heard you say at once," she said. He looked down. "I know. Don't apologize for it." She held the door. "I hear you, Gideon." She went inside. She stood at the stove and put her hands flat on the cool iron and breathed. Outside, she could hear him get up from the porch, step the particular creak of it she'd memorized by now, and walk toward the barn. Something was changing between them, slowly, the way seasons change in high country, not in one event but in accumulation, in the sum of small days. She was not ready to name it. She was not sure she trusted it enough yet to name it, but she stopped trying to argue herself out of it. She lit the stove and started supper, and the wind came down off the mountain, and the house held against it, the way it had been built to hold, the way anything built with care and intention holds against the things that come for it. Outside, the last light left the peaks and the stars came in over Whisper Ridge, and in the barn she could hear Gideon talking to Pocket and Ruin in the low, unhurried voice he used with the animals, the same voice she'd noticed that he was slowly starting to use with her. She was still afraid. That hadn't gone away. But she was no longer afraid of him. She had begun, very slowly and very quietly, like a fire catching on its second or third try, to understand that the life being built in this cold and difficult and beautiful place might be the first one that had ever truly been hers. Winter broke late that year on Whisper Ridge, the way it sometimes does at elevation, not gradually, but in a single week of hard, warm wind that came out of the south and took the snow off the upper pasture in sheets. leaving the ground underneath dark and wet and smelling of things that had been waiting under ice for months. Clementine noticed the change in Gideon before she understood why it was happening. He started sleeping less. She could hear him some nights moving through the house in the dark hours, not restless pacing. Nothing dramatic, just the particular quiet sounds of a man who has given up on sleep and is doing something useful, sharpening tools, checking the lockbox. Once, past midnight, she heard him on the porch for over an hour, and she lay in the dark bedroom and listened to the silence between his footsteps and understood that he was watching the lower road. She didn't say anything about it. She started sleeping lighter herself. Spring in the mountains was not the gentle thing people from lower elevations imagined. It was aggressive and wet and full of work, the kind of accumulated maintenance that winter had deferred, and that now presented itself all at once. Fences to repair, ground to break for the kitchen garden she'd decided to plant along the south wall of the house. The herd needed moving to the upper pasture now that the grass was coming in, which required 2 full days of driving, and the kind of sustained physical effort that left her too tired in the evenings to do much beyond eat and sit by the fire. She was grateful for the tiredness. It kept her from thinking too carefully about Finch. The letter came the second week of April. It arrived with the supply rider who came up from the valley every 2 weeks with flour and salt and whatever mail had accumulated at the Oakhaven post. Gideon read it at the table. His face did not change while he read it, which meant it was bad. He set it down and pushed it across to her without comment. It was written in the precise, pleasant language of a man who has lawyers available to him. Jeremiah Finch, on behalf of the Oakhaven Territorial Land Trust, which Clementine had never heard of before, and suspected had been created specifically for this purpose, was notifying Gideon Hayes that a survey discrepancy had been identified in the original deed for the Whisper Ridge property. Pending resolution of the discrepancy, a claim had been filed with the county land office contesting the southern boundary. A hearing was scheduled for June. In the interim, no improvements or transfers of the contested acreage were permissible. The Oakhaven Territorial Land Trust, she said. Didn't exist 3 months ago, Gideon said. How do you know? Because I asked around after we talked in February. Had a man I trust check the county filings. Nothing under that name. He drank his coffee. He filed it in March. She read the letter again. Survey discrepancy. What discrepancy? There isn't one. The original survey is clean. I had it checked independently when I bought the claim. His voice was even, but she had learned to hear what was under the evenness. He'll produce one. He'll find a surveyor willing to submit an amended report. Can he do that? He's done it before. She set the letter down. Who's the land office clerk? Man named Aldous Beecham. Been in the job 12 years. Is he honest? A pause. He's not dishonest, Gideon said carefully. But he's not a man who goes looking for trouble either. If a filing comes in, properly formatted with the right signatures, Beecham processes it. That's his job as he understands it. Then we need to get to Beecham before Finch does. The filing's already in. I don't mean about the filing. She folded the letter and set it aside. I mean, we need to establish a relationship with that man before Finch can pressure him, so that when we bring evidence, he knows who we are. And we're not just names on a counterpaper. Gideon looked at her. We should also contact the lawyer in Denver, she said. The one you sent the property copies to. Hargrove. Sam Hargrove. Write to him today. Tell him about the hearing date. Tell him about the land trust. And ask him what the legal exposure looks like if Finch produces a fraudulent survey. She was thinking out loud now, the way she thought when a problem was real and required actual engagement rather than worry. And we need witnesses, people who knew the original boundaries, neighbors who've dealt with you on the southern pasture. Aldermans, he said slowly. Tom Alderman's been running cattle on the valley side for 9 years. He'd know where my fence posts were. Talk to him. He might not want to get involved. Finch has reach in the valley. Ask him anyway. Let him decide. She stood up and took both their cups to the basin. We have 2 months before June. That's enough time to do this right if we start today. She heard him behind her, the small sound of him exhaling through his nose, which she had learned was the sound he made when he was recalibrating something. Not resistance. Reorientation. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about it since November." She rinsed the cups. "I've had time." They rode down to the valley together 3 days later to visit Tom Alderman. The Alderman place was a working spread, honest and functional in the way of ranches that have been tended rather than shown off, and Tom himself was a stout, careful man of about 60, with the particular skepticism of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by much. He read the letter slowly. He read it again. "Land trust," he said. "Created March 10th, Gideon said. "I know what Finch is doing," Alderman said. He gave the letter back. He tried something similar with Carlisle up on the North Ridge 2 years ago. Carlisle sold because he didn't have the money to fight it. He looked at Gideon. "You're not going to sell?" "No." Alderman looked at Clementine. He'd barely spoken to her since they arrived, not rudely, but the careful, measured way of a man deciding something. "You're Caldwell's girl," he said. "Married Hayes in October." "Yes." Calvin was a useless man, Alderman said. Not unkindly, factually. "Yes," she said. Something in his expression settled. "You're nothing like him," he said. "Heard you've been working the ridge since October." "Yes." "Hard winter." It was. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd been calculating. Then he looked back at Gideon. "What do you need?" "Sworn statement that you've known the southern boundary of my property for 9 years, and where it's... That's all?" "That's a great deal," Clementine said. "And we're not asking you to take on Finch directly." Sworn statement on record is harder for him to argue with than anything else we can put in front of Beecham, because it comes from someone who isn't us. Alderman was quiet for a moment. "My wife's been wanting me to give Finch a hard time for 2 years, he said finally. Since he bought the Carlisle debt and extended the Valley Road toll, he stood up. "I'll write the statement. I know 2 other ranchers who will too, if you want them." They rode back up the mountain that afternoon with 3 names and a promise. Clementine felt something she recognized only in retrospect as the specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Not dramatically, not heroically, just right. The steady accumulation of the right pieces in the right order. What she didn't account for was Finch not waiting for June. Came on a Thursday, in the second week of May, when the upper pasture was fully green, and the days had reached the length where there was still light at 7 in the evening. Gideon had ridden north that morning to check on a section of fence the runoff had weakened, which meant he was 2 miles from the house when Clementine was in the barn at midday and heard horses on the lower road. She heard them before she saw them. 4 horses, moving at pace, not the casual amble of neighbors dropping by. She came to the barn door and counted the riders as they came around the final bend. 4 men. She recognized Finch by his posture, that compact, self-satisfied set of him, his coat pressed even up here at elevation, and she recognized 2 of the others by type, if not by name, hired men, kind whose job it is to make other people's decisions feel final. The 4th she didn't know. He was younger, carrying a satchel. She did not go inside and lock the door. She almost did. The instinct was there, old and practiced. Hide. Make yourself small. Wait for it to pass. She walked out to the yard instead and stood in front of the house. Finch pulled up and looked down at her from his horse. "Mrs. Hayes." He said it, the way people use correct titles when they want to make clear they find the title absurd. "Mr. Finch." She kept her voice even. "My husband isn't here." "I'm not here for your husband." He dismounted. The others stayed mounted, which she noted. "I'm here to serve notice of an injunction." He nodded at the young man with the satchel who climbed down and approached her with a folded document. Took it. She read it on the spot. It was, as far as she could tell from the legal language, an order from the county court she could not immediately confirm whether it was genuine, requiring cessation of any land modification on the southern 60 acres pending the June hearing. Specifically, it cited an ongoing improvement project as a violation of the interim order from the April letter. "There's no improvement project," she said. The fence posts your husband installed in March, Finch said pleasantly. Those are repairs to existing fence. The fence has been there for 7 years. That's a matter for the hearing to determine. She looked at him. She had spent her whole life reading men who intended something other than what they were saying, and what she read in Finch now was not legal process. Legal process doesn't require 4 men on horseback for a document delivery. He was here to see the property. He was here to assess what he'd be dealing with. He was also, she understood suddenly, here to assess her, to see if she'd crack. I'll see that my husband receives this, she said, folded the document. I'd also like to inspect the southern fence line, Finch said, while I'm here. The injunction, she said, does not entitle you to enter this property without the owner present. She had read enough of Sam Hargrove's letter, which had arrived 2 weeks ago, to know this. My husband will contact your lawyer regarding any inspection that needs to occur. Through proper channels. Finch looked at her for a long moment. One of the hired men shifted his horse. She heard it and did not look at it. She kept her eyes on Finch. You've gotten confident, he said. Since October. I was always confident, she said. You just weren't paying attention. Something moved across his face. Not anger, he was too controlled for visible anger. Something colder, which was worse. The June hearing will go a certain way, he said. Beecham has reviewed the survey. There's a reasonable possibility your husband's deed will be found non-conforming. Then we'll address that at the hearing, she said. There are ways this ends badly for both of you that the hearing doesn't fix. Contested property is an insecure property. Creditors get uncomfortable. Supply lines become unreliable. He said this gently, as if he were explaining something unfortunate but inevitable. I'd encourage you to discuss with your husband whether this is worth the fight. We'll discuss it, she said. Goodbye, Mr. Finch. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he mounted his horse, and the 4 of them turned and rode back down the lower road. She stood in the yard until the sound of hooves disappeared. Then she sat down on the porch step, put her elbows on her knees, and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, which was what they'd been wanting to do since she'd heard the horses. When the 30 seconds were up, she stood, went inside, and wrote down everything she could remember from the conversation in the precise order it had occurred, because she had a feeling it would matter later. Gideon came back at dusk. She showed him the document and her notes. He read both without speaking. The line of his jaw was set in the particular way she'd come to understand meant something he wouldn't say out loud. He came up here himself, Gideon said. Yes, he doesn't do that. He sends men. He wanted to see the property, and he wanted to see me. She paused. He wanted to see if I'd fall apart. Gideon looked at her notes again. You handled it right. I know. Not arrogance, just fact. But Gideon, he mentioned creditors and supply lines. She watched his face. Is there anything on this property that he can touch? Any debt I don't know about? No debt. He set the papers down. The supply writer Holt, he's reliable. Been making this run for 6 years. Could Finch pressure him? A pause. Holt's brother-in-law works at Finch's bank. She absorbed this. We need an alternate supplier. The aldermans. Yes. She was already thinking 2 steps ahead, which was the only way she knew to think when a situation was actively moving. And we need to move faster with Hargrove. Can you ride to the telegraph station in Millhaven tomorrow? That's a day and a half, I know. She met his eyes. Can you? He was quiet for a moment. Yes. He left the next morning before dawn. She watched him go from the porch, the lamp still burning inside behind her, and the enormity of the silence he left was immediate and complete. 2 miles to the nearest neighbor, a day and a half in any direction to anyone who could help. She went inside and picked up the short rifle he'd given her in December. She checked it the way he'd taught her, methodically and without drama, and she set it beside the kitchen door. Then she got to work. Gideon returned on the 3rd day with a letter from Hargrove that was longer than any of the previous ones. Hargrove had made inquiries at the county court. The injunction Finch had served was genuine but narrowly scoped. It covered modifications to contested acreage, not the full property. More importantly, Hargrove had identified 2 prior cases where the Oakhaven Territorial Land Trust had been involved in boundary disputes, both resulting in favorable outcomes for Finch, both involving the same surveyor, a man named Edmund Pruitt out of Salida. The same surveyor who had, according to a preliminary county inquiry Hargrove had initiated, submitted the amended survey that formed the basis of Finch's June complaint against Whisper Ridge. Pruitt, Gideon said. He's done this before, Clementine said. She had the letter laid flat on the table with her notes beside it, twice for Finch. And Hargrove says there may be a 3rd case in Fremont County he's still verifying. She tapped the letter. A man who falsifies surveys for money is a man with a pattern, and a pattern is evidence. Can Hargrove get Pruitt's other surveys into the June hearing? He says yes, if he can get certified copies from Fremont County before the date. He wants to know if you can pay his advance. She named the figure. She watched Gideon's face. I can pay it, he said, then write to him tonight and send it in the morning. They worked at the table together for 2 hours, Gideon drafting the letter to Hargrove, Clementine composing a separate letter to Beecham at the land office, framing the request for the June hearing to include testimony from aldermen and the 2 other ranchers. She wrote carefully in her best hand with the deliberate formal language she'd taught herself from reading every document she'd ever come across in her father's house and later in her own. At some point past 9 o'clock, Gideon looked over at what she'd written. Where did you learn to write like that? He said. My mother. She didn't look up from the letter. She said a woman who can write a precise letter can go anywhere a man can go. It just takes longer. He was quiet for a moment. Then she was right. She usually was. May moved toward June in the grinding way of a month that knows something is coming. Tension on the ridge was not the dramatic kind, not raised voices, not sleepless pacing, not the theater of anxiety. It was quieter and more sustained, the way real tension lives in the body rather than in the air. Clementine woke early most mornings and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the property, the horses, the cattle, the creek before deciding everything was where it should be. She and Gideon had stopped maintaining the careful physical distance of the first months, not dramatically, not consciously, but incrementally the way winter recedes. There was an evening in late April when she'd been reading at the table, and he'd sat down beside her rather than across from her, and neither of them had remarked on it. There was the morning she'd come into the kitchen to find he'd already made coffee and had poured a cup for her without being asked, at the strength she preferred rather than the strength he preferred, and she'd looked at the cup and then at him, and he'd already looked back down at what he was doing. She had stopped trying to argue herself out of what was growing between them. There wasn't time for that kind of internal argument anymore. Life on the ridge was too immediate, too demanding of presence for her to have much energy left over for the old habit of preemptive self-protection. Still, she did not say anything, neither did he. They were both people who had learned that words, once spoken, changed the landscape, and the landscape they had was working. The night of the 14th of May, she was in the barn at dusk, finishing the evening feed, when she heard Gideon shout her name from somewhere near the south fence line. Not calling, shouting. She dropped the feed bucket and moved. He was at the top of the south pasture, 200 yards from the barn, and he was kneeling on the ground with his right hand pressed against his thigh. For a single terrible second she thought gunshot. Then she got close enough to see it was a gash deep. From the look of the blood, but not a bullet wound. He'd been clearing brush from the fence line, and the axe had deflected off a knot in the wood and caught his leg. He was pale in a way she'd never seen him pale. It's deep, he said. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a man concentrating hard on steadiness. I know. She was already pulling her overskirt off. It was the most material she had immediately available, and pressing it against the wound. Can you walk? If I have to. You have to. She got her shoulder under his arm. Come on. Leave the axe. They got to the house in a progression that was slow and ungainly, and involved more of his weight on her than she'd have thought she could bear. but she bore it. The wound needed cleaning and closing, and she had dealt with cuts and injuries. Her whole life, not like this, not this deep, but the principles were the same, and she did not allow herself the luxury of panic, because panic was not useful. Cleaned it with the whiskey he kept for such occasions, and he made a sound that was not quite a word, and she said, "Hold still," with enough authority that he did. She had needle and thread from her sewing kit, and she had her hands in the right position before she'd consciously decided to do it, which was how she handled things that would overwhelm her if she thought about them too directly. She sewed him up in the lamplight while he gripped the table edge and stared at the wall and said nothing. When she was done, she sat back and looked at her work. "That'll hold," she said. He looked down at it. "Yes," he said. "Will." She became aware that her hands were shaking again. The 30-second rule, she thought, and gave herself 30 seconds to let them. Then she pressed her palms flat on the table. "You'll be off the leg for a week minimum," she said. "I know. I can manage the cattle in the pasture." "Clementine." "I can," she said, more forcefully than she meant to. "I have been managing half of this operation for 6 months. I know where the upper pasture fence is weak. I know which of the cattle push north when they shouldn't. I know the creek crossing and the hay stores and how long we have before we need to resupply." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say all of that. It had come out because she was shaken and because she was angry not at him, not at the axe, at the situation, at the timing, at the fact that Finch was out there moving pieces on a board. And now this. Gideon looked at her across the table. "I know you can," he said quietly. "That's not what I was going to say." She waited. "I was going to say thank you," he said. She exhaled. A long, slow exhale that let something out of her chest that had been compressed there for hours. "You're welcome," she said. 4 days later they came. Gideon was in the house, leg elevated on the chair, when Clementine, who had been at the barn, heard horses on the lower road again. More horses this time. She counted through the barn door. 7. Finch was among them. So were the same 2 hired men from before. The others were strangers. One of them had the particular organized bearing of someone who had done this kind of work enough to do it efficiently, and he was carrying rope. Clementine's mind went very still. She looked at the short rifle inside the barn door. She looked at the house where Gideon was, one good leg and a wound 4 days old. She looked at the 7 riders. She thought about hiding. She thought about it for exactly the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out. Then she picked up the rifle and walked out of the barn. Finch saw her immediately. His horse pulled up short, Mrs. Hayes. The pleasantness in his voice was entirely gone now. "This is an authorized entry pursuant to—" "It isn't," she said. She was in the middle of the yard between the barn and the house, with the rifle not quite raised and not quite lowered. She had never pointed a gun at a person in her life. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. "The court order does not authorize entry without the property owner present," she said. "My husband is present. This is his property. You are not welcome on it." "Your husband," one of the hired men said, looking toward the house, "can barely walk, from what I hear." "He can walk far enough," Gideon's voice said. She had not heard the door. He was on the porch now, his weight on his left leg, the long rifle across his arm. He looked gray and he was not entirely steady, and he looked, also, like a man who had made a set of decisions about the next several minutes that he was at complete peace with. Finch looked from Gideon to Clementine and back. 7 men. 2 of them. 1 of them wounded. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Finch said. "You rode 7 men up a mountain," Gideon said. "That's how hard you think it needs to be." "The June hearing is a month away," Clementine said. "And you came here with rope." She kept her eyes on Finch. "That's not a legal visit. That's a different kind of visit. And every man you brought up here knows it." One of the strangers in the back, the one with the organized bearing, shifted in his saddle. "This isn't what I hired on for," he said, not to Finch, to no one in particular. "Turn," Finch said sharply. "I was told this was a document delivery," the man said. "I see a woman standing in a yard with a rifle and a man on a porch. I'm not riding through that. You're being paid to deliver papers, not to push through two armed people on their own land. The man turned his horse. I'll wait at the bottom of the road. Two of the other strangers followed him without a word, which left four, counting Finch. The arithmetic had changed. Finch looked at Clementine. She looked back at him. The rifle was still not quite raised, not quite lowered. This will be resolved in June, he said finally. In court, where your rifle doesn't matter. We'll be there, she said. Turned his horse. The three remaining men turned with him. She watched them go down the lower road, the same way she'd watched him go in April, until the sound of hooves was gone, and the ridge was quiet again. She heard Gideon come off the porch slowly, painfully, and cross the yard. She had not moved. She was still standing in the middle of the yard with the rifle in her hands. You all right? He said. Yes. She lowered the rifle. Her arms ached from holding it in that position. He'll come back. Not like this. No. He'll do it through the hearing. She turned to look at Gideon. His face was pale, and there was sweat on his jaw from the effort of getting to the porch. You need to sit down. In a minute now, she said. I did not sew your leg closed so you could tear it open, standing on a porch playing at intimidation. He almost smiled. It was small and it was tired, and it was the realest expression she'd ever seen on him. All right, he said. She walked beside him back to the house, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, not quite supporting him, but there, present. He didn't pull away from it. Inside, she settled him in the chair with his leg up, and she leaned the rifle against the wall. And she stood in the middle of the room for a moment while the adrenaline finished moving through her body and left behind the peculiar exhausted clarity that comes after something real. She thought about the 7 riders. She thought about the man who had turned away, the one called Turn, who had looked at her standing in the yard and decided this wasn't what he'd signed on for. She thought about her own hands, steady. Even at the end, she had spent 26 years being told what she was and wasn't capable of. Father, by that town, by every person who had looked at her shoulders and her hands and her face and done the math wrong. She looked at those hands now in the lamplight. They were large. They had always been large, that had always been part of the inventory of things that were wrong with her. Large and rough, and not the hands of a woman anyone had ever thought to protect. They had sewn Gideon's leg closed in the dark. They had held a rifle steady while 7 men decided whether to push through. They had laid fires and driven fence posts and handled horses and written legal letters and packed wounds with clean cloth, closed them and opened them. Clementine, Gideon said. She looked over at him. He was watching her from the chair with the same attention he'd given her since the beginning, the kind that cost him something, the kind he didn't give easily. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. What I said in the fall, that I brought you up here for practical reasons. He paused. That was true then. But it's not the whole of it now. And I think you should know that. Given what just happened, given everything. He stopped. He was not a man who apologized for finding words hard, but he was also a man who kept pushing until he found them. What I'm trying to say is that I would have come to that porch, whether I could walk or not for the property. He held her gaze. For you, fire was low. Outside, the last light was going off the upper peaks. The ridge was entirely quiet. Clementine crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside him, not across from him. Beside him, close enough that their arms were touching, and she did not say anything for a long time, because she was thinking about her mother's voice, about California, about standing in a churchyard in October, in her good dress with a bag already packed, about large hands and 30-second rules and the particular low quality of Gideon's voice when he talked to the horses in the dark. I know, she said finally. I've known for a while. He was quiet. Me too, she said, in case that wasn't clear. He exhaled the long, slow exhale of a man who has been carrying something at elevation for a long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. Outside, the dark came down over Whisper Ridge, and inside the house the lamp burned steady. And somewhere down the mountain, Jeremiah Finch was riding back toward Oakhaven with 3 men and a plan that hadn't worked. And the June hearing was still coming. and none of that was resolved. But in the house, beside the fire, two people who had been told most of their lives that they were not enough sat beside each other in the particular silence of people who have stopped needing to convince themselves of something. 2 weeks before the June hearing were the busiest of Clementine's life, and her life had not been short on busy weeks. Gideon's leg healed the way wounds heal on men who refused to respect them slower than it should have, because he kept walking on it faster than it had any right to, because he was otherwise in good health and ate what she put in front of him without argument. By the last week of May, he was moving at something close to his normal pace, though she could see the careful way he came down porch steps and the particular set of his jaw when he'd been on his feet too long. She said nothing about it. He knew his own body, and they had too much to do for her to spend energy managing what he wouldn't be managed about. Sam Hargrove had written twice more since the telegraphed instruction in April. The second letter, the one that mattered, arrived the 23rd of May and was the longest thing she'd ever read from a lawyer, which said something because she had read a fair number of legal documents in the past several months, and lawyers as a group were not known for brevity. But what Hargrove had assembled was worth the length. Edmund Pruitt, the surveyor who had submitted the amended boundary report on behalf of Finch's Land Trust, had indeed filed surveys in Fremont County 2 years prior, 2 of them, for 2 separate properties. In both cases, the surveys had adjusted boundary lines in ways that benefited the purchasing party, who had in both cases been a land speculation concern connected, through 2 layers of intermediary companies, to Jeremiah Finch. In one of those cases, the original property owner had attempted to contest the survey and had been unable to secure legal representation willing to go up against Finch's resources. He had settled. Hargrove had obtained certified copies of both original surveys, both of Pruitt's amended reports, and the settlement documentation from Fremont County. He had also, through a contact at the Territorial Surveyor's Office in Denver, obtained a professional assessment comparing Pruitt's amended surveys to the original ones. The assessment concluded, in the measured but unambiguous language of a man who had spent 30 years doing this work, that the boundary adjustments in both cases were not supported by any physical evidence on the ground and appeared to reflect errors or deliberate misrepresentation. He had then compared this to the Whisper Ridge amended survey. The boundary adjustment Pruitt had submitted for Finch's June complaint used, in 3 specific places, identical language to the Fremont County amendments, word for word. The kind of identical that does not happen by coincidence. Clementine read this section of the letter 3 times. Use the same template, she said. Gideon was reading over her shoulder. He didn't even change the language. He didn't think he needed to. She set the letter down. Finch has never had anyone come back at him with this kind of preparation. Every previous case, the property owner didn't have the resources, or the contacts, or the time. He's used to operating in a county where no one is looking hard enough to find the pattern. Until now. She looked up at him. Hargrove says he can present this at the hearing if Beecham allows external documentation. And he? County land hearings are informal enough that Beecham has discretion. Gideon straightened up. Question is whether Beecham will allow it, or whether Finch has gotten to him in the weeks since April. This was the thing she'd been turning over for days. Beecham was not corrupt. She still believed that, based on everything she'd learned about the man, but he was cautious, and caution in a man with a county appointment could look a lot like cowardice when it mattered. We go in person, she said, before the hearing, not to pressure him, just to let him see us. He knows who I am. He knows who you were, a mountain man who kept to himself. She folded Hargrove's letter along its original creases. He doesn't know what we've built. He doesn't know about Alderman's statement or the Fremont County surveys or any of it. If he walks into that hearing room on June 10th, knowing the weight of what we're bringing, he's less likely to find reasons to limit it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You want to go to Oakhaven. The word landed in the room with some weight. She had not been back to Oakhaven since October. She had not particularly wanted to go back to Oak Haven. The decision to leave had felt final in a way that going back would complicate, not logistically, but in some internal register she hadn't fully examined. "Yes," she said. "You don't have to go in person. I know I don't have to." She picked up the letter. "I want to. If we're going to win this, I want to be standing in that room when we do." They rode down the mountain together on the 1st of June, arriving in Oak Haven in the early afternoon, when the town was at its midweek ordinary, the kind of day where nothing was happening, but everything was quietly going on. She had thought about this ride during the weeks of preparation, had tried to prepare herself for the specific experience of returning to a place that had last seen her being pulled to the front of a church by her wrist. She had not prepared adequately. It was not that anyone was overtly unkind. It was subtler than that, the particular awareness of her own body, in a street where people knew things about her that she'd never told them, where the sight of her was attached in certain minds to a memory she'd spent 8 months trying to get clear of. Mrs. Hargrove came out of the millinery, saw her, and produced an expression that tried to be several things at once and landed on none of them. The Danby brothers were not in evidence, which was a mercy. Gideon walked beside her without touching her, which was right. This was not a moment for demonstration. It was a moment for the business they had come to do, but his presence at her shoulder was its own kind of statement, and she was aware of it. They went to the land office first. Aldous Beecham was a slight man, tidy in the way of men who've worked with paper their whole lives, with the mildly startled expression of someone who has just been handed something unexpected. He had that expression now, looking at the two of standing on the other side of his counter. "Mr. Hayes," he said, we don't usually. "We'd like a few minutes," Gideon said. "If you have that." Beecham looked at Clementine. She returned his look steadily, not confrontationally, just present. "5 minutes," he said. They gave him 15. Or rather, Clementine gave him 15, because she did most of the talking not rapidly, not pressingly, but in the organized way she'd been arranging her thoughts since Hargrove's letter. She outlined what they had: the Fremont County surveys, the professional assessment, Alderman's statement, and the 2 corroborating statements from neighboring ranchers, the word-for-word language in Pruitt's reports. She did not tell him what to do with it. She did not suggest how he should rule. She simply put it in front of him the way you put facts in front of someone who you're trusting to know what facts are for. When she finished, Beecham was quiet for a long moment. "Great deal of material," he said. "Yes," she said. "Finch's filing is properly formatted. The survey is certified by a surveyor who certified identical language in 2 other counties in service of the same interest." She kept her voice level. "We're not asking you to decide the hearing today, Mr. Beecham. We're asking you to allow all relevant documentation into the record on the 10th, and that's within your discretion." He looked at the copies she'd laid on the counter. "I'll need to review these before the hearing," he said. "Of course." She pushed them toward him. "Those are your copies. Pick them up carefully." He looked at Gideon. "You're planning to have Hargrove present?" "By letter," Gideon said. "He can't make the distance from Denver in time, but his written assessment is notarized and certified." Beecham nodded slowly. The startled quality had left his expression. What replaced it was something more considered. He was taking them seriously. She realized, not as a nuisance he needed to process, but as a case that required actual attention. "10th," he said. 9 o'clock. "We'll be there," Clementine said. They had time left in the day after Beecham. More time than she'd expected. The meeting had taken less than she'd planned for, which meant the afternoon was open. Gideon suggested the hotel for supper rather than the long ride back up the mountain in fading light, and she agreed. And they sat in the hotel dining room, the same hotel dining room where she had, 8 months ago, been considered not worth the price of a meal, and ate something that was not quite good but was warm, and she didn't have to cook it. Halfway through supper, her father walked in. She saw him before he saw her. Calvin Caldwell, looking smaller than she remembered him. Not physically, he'd always been a slight man, but in some other dimension, substantial. He was with two men she didn't recognize, and he was talking in the animated way he talked when he was either mildly drunk or trying to impress someone, and he hadn't looked toward their table yet. Then he looked. He stopped talking mid-sentence. She did not look away. She had spent a lot of her life looking away from her father, dropping her eyes, making herself smaller, trying not to be the next available problem. She was done with that particular habit. Calvin Caldwell looked at his daughter sitting in a hotel dining room with a man she was married to, dressed in clothes that fit, and her hair put up and her back straight, and something moved across his face that she could not read precisely and did not try to. After a moment, he lifted his chin in a kind of nod, an acknowledgement. She gave him a nod back. Nothing more. He went to a table on the far side of the room. She turned back to her supper. Gideon had watched this entire exchange over the rim of his coffee cup without comment. When she looked at him, he just waited. "That's the first time I've looked at him straight on in my life," she said, "and not felt like I was doing something wrong." What did it feel like? She thought about it honestly. Like nothing, she said, which is probably what it should feel like. He nodded. He drank his coffee. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. "No," she said. "I want to finish my supper." So they did. The morning of June 10th arrived dry and cool, the kind of early summer morning the high country produces between late frosts and real heat. They rode down together, arriving in Oakhaven before 8, and the county land office was already more crowded than Clementine had expected. She had not anticipated the audience. Word had gotten through the valley the way word always moved in small counties, which was through everyone's mouth simultaneously origin, and without any clear origin that the Whisper Ridge hearings was something other than routine. The aldermans were there, the two corroborating ranchers. Several people she didn't recognize and a few she did, including, to her surprise, the man Turn, who had turned his horse on Finch's second ride up the mountain and ridden away. He stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands and made no indication of knowing her. Finch was present. He had a lawyer, with him a man from out of county, by the look of him, well-dressed and comfortable in professional settings. He had Pruitt with him. He had two associates she'd never seen. He looked at Clementine when she walked in, and she watched something shift in his calculation. He had not expected her to come down off the mountain. She could see it, the brief recalibration, the adjustment. Good, she thought. Let him recalibrate. Beecham called the hearing to order at 9:05. He was not a dramatic man. The hearing was businesslike, conducted at a plain table with a record book and no particular ceremony. Finch's lawyer presented the amended survey, and the land trust's claim first, as the initiating party, and did so with the fluency of a man who had done this many times, and found it worked best when it moved quickly and seemed inevitable. Then Beecham said, "Mr. Hayes, you may present your response." Gideon began. He laid out the original deed, the independent survey, 7 years of tax receipts, the physical evidence from the fence markers. Tom Alderman read his statement himself, which had not been part of the original plan, but which Alderman had decided to do, and which was significantly more effective than a read document. The voice of a man who had run cattle in this valley for 9 years, who knew where the fence posts were, because he'd helped carry some of them, who looked at Finch's lawyer across the table with the expression of a man who found the entire proceeding faintly insulting. Then Clementine put Hargrove's assessment on the table. She presented it herself. She had discussed this with Gideon, and he had not argued. He understood that she had the clearer grasp of the legal architecture of it, and that her voice in this room, on this day, meant something different than it had meant in October. She walked Beecham through it methodically. The Fremont County surveys, comparison, the word-for-word language. She was precise, and she was not theatrical about it, because the material was strong enough that theater would only diminish it. When she got to the third identical passage, the exact phrase repeated in Pruitt's reports from 3 counties, she heard movement in the room. Not dramatic. Just the particular small sounds people make when they understand something. Finch's lawyer objected to the Fremont County materials as outside the scope of the present filing. Beecham considered this for a long moment. The scope of this hearing, he said finally, is the accuracy of the boundary survey submitted in support of the land trust's claim. Documentation relevant to the credibility of the surveyor who submitted that report is within scope. He looked at Pruitt. Mr. Pruitt, you're welcome to respond to any of this documentation. Pruitt was a thin man who had spent the morning looking comfortable and now did not look comfortable. He looked, in fact, like a man who was doing rapid arithmetic and not enjoying the results. He said he would need time to review the Fremont County materials. How much time? Beecham said. A week, at minimum. The hearing will recess for 1 week, Beecham said. Mr. Pruitt, I'll want a written response to each of the 3 specific passages identified by Mrs. Hayes, in writing, notarized, submitted to this office by the 17th. Mrs. Hayes Beecham had used her name. Not the property owner's wife or Mr. Hayes's representative. Her name. She filed that away. The week's recess turned out to matter more than the recess itself. On the 14th of June, 3 days after the hearing, Clementine was in the kitchen garden when she heard a horse on the lower road moving faster than normal. Not the flat-out run of panic, but urgent. She set down her tools and went to the porch. The rider was the supply man, Holt. He pulled up breathing hard and handed her a letter before he'd fully stop. It was from Tom Alderman, dated that morning. She read it standing in the yard. Then she read it again. Edmund Pruitt had resigned from the Territorial Surveyor's certification list the previous day. No explanation given. His resignation had been processed by the Denver office within hours, which suggested it had been anticipated at that level. Alderman had heard this from the county clerk's assistant, who had heard it from the certification office itself. She was inside writing a letter to Hargrove before Holt had watered his horse. Hargrove's response, which came back in 4 days, which was remarkable speed for Denver correspondence, explained what she'd suspected. A surveyor who resigns his certification in the middle of an active county hearing before submitting a required written response has effectively acknowledged that the response he would have submitted would not have withstood scrutiny. It did not constitute a legal admission, but it was, in the calculus of a county land office hearing, the kind of development that made certain subsequent arguments very difficult to maintain. Finch's lawyer, on the morning of the 17th, filed a motion to dismiss the land trust's claim. He framed it as a voluntary withdrawal in light of unresolved survey questions. Beecham accepted the withdrawal, entered it in the record, and noted in writing, which Beecham was meticulous about, that the withdrawal was made while the counter-evidence of the opposing party was in full standing. That notation in the record was Hargrove's doing. He had written to Beecham directly, recommending that specific language, because a withdrawal with that notation on record protected the Whisper Ridge deed from future challenges, but by the same party on the same grounds. Gideon read the withdrawal notice at the kitchen table that evening. "It's over," he said. "For now," she said. "You think he'll come back at us?" She thought about Finch, the compact, controlled man who had stood in her yard twice and ridden away twice. A man like that did not stop wanting what he wanted. But a man like that also read arithmetic correctly, and the arithmetic of the Whisper Ridge situation had changed. There were signed statements from 3 neighboring ranchers in Beecham's records. Now, there was a notarized professional assessment from a Denver lawyer. There was a surveyor's resignation that was effectively public knowledge in the county. And there was a notation in the official record that the withdrawal happened while their counter-evidence stood. Coming back at them would require building a whole new case from zero against an opponent who had now demonstrated, in a public forum, exactly what she was capable of. Not the same way, she said. Not through Beecham. Cost him more than the land is worth. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Sam Hargrove says there are 2 other families in this county who lost property to Finch through similar means. In the past 3 years. She looked at him. He put that in the letter? Last paragraph. She held out her hand. He gave her the letter. She read the last paragraph twice. Hargrove had contacts at the territorial governor's office in Denver. Pattern they had documented the land trust, Pruitt. The identical survey language was, in Hargrove's professional view, sufficient basis for a territorial investigation into fraudulent land acquisition practices. He was not suggesting this was their obligation to pursue. He was simply noting that the documentation they had assembled would be of considerable interest to parties who had the authority to act on it. He's asking if we want to take it further, she said. Yes. She set the letter down. She looked at the window, at the evening light on the upper pasture. She thought about the Greer family, who were tenant farming their own land. She thought about Carlyle on the North Ridge, who had sold because he couldn't afford to fight. She thought about every property owner in this county who had faced Finch's machine alone, without a Denver lawyer, and a patient year of preparation, and the particular stubbornness of two people who had nothing left to lose. Write to Hargrove, she said. Tell him yes. The letter to the territorial governor's office went out on the 20th of June. They did not expect rapid results. A territorial investigation moved on its own schedule, driven by political considerations they had no view of and couldn't predict. But the letter was sent, the documentation was attached, and the thing was now in motion. What happened in Oakhaven in the weeks that followed was not dramatic. It was the quieter thing, the kind of change that doesn't arrive in a single moment, but settles over a place the way weather settles, gradually and completely. People knew. That was the first thing. A county land hearing in a small town is a public proceeding, and what had happened in Beecham's office on the 10th of June was known by the end of that day to everyone in Oakhaven who cared to know. What Clementine had put on that table, what Pruitt had done afterward, what the withdrawal notice said. This moved through the valley the way everything moved in a small county. The effect was not universal. There were people who had attached themselves to Finch's interests too thoroughly to shift easily, and they did not shift. But there were others, the people who had looked the other way, who had done business with Finch because he was the dominant financial force in the county, and not because they particularly chose to, who now did a different kind of arithmetic. The supply rider, Holt, came up to the ridge the week after the withdrawal. He was a lean, weathered man who had always been professional and no more, and he came this time with an extra load that Clementine hadn't ordered. "What's this?" she asked, checking the manifest. "Mrs. Alderman sent the flour and the dried beans," he said. "Said to tell you she was glad it came out right." Clementine stood with the manifest for a moment. "Tell her thank you," she said, "and tell her the cornbread I made last week with her flour was better than anything I've managed in a year." Holt almost smiled. "I'll tell her." She filed that away too. The small shifting of a community that had watched which way the wind was going and decided, having watched, to take a position. On the 3rd of July, 2 territorial officers arrived in Oakhaven. They were not advertising their purpose, but in a town the size of Oakhaven, 2 men from Denver with official authorization papers do not move invisibly. Word reached the ridge the same day through Alderman, who sent his youngest son up the mountain with a note. The note said, "They went to the bank first." Clementine read this at the kitchen table, with Gideon standing at the window. "How long do you think the investigation takes?" she asked. Hargrove said months, Gideon said. "Maybe a year. Depends on what they find and how far it goes." "It'll go past Finch," she said. "If Pruitt worked for him on multiple properties, there are other people involved. The land trust has officers of record." She folded Alderman's note. "We're not going to see the end of it cleanly. It's going to be messy and slow, and some of it won't resolve the way it should." "Probably," he said. "That's all right," she said. "We did our part." He turned from the window. "You did more than your part," he said. She looked at him. He was framed in the afternoon light, bigger than the window really had room for, with the particular quality of stillness she had come to know as his version of being fully present, not restless, not distracted there. "We did it together," she said. He didn't argue the point. He came away from the window and sat down at the table across from her. which was where he sat, which was where he'd been sitting for months now, across from her. Not at the head of the table, not at a distance that required raising your voice. Cross. I want to go back, she said, to Oakhaven, for the hearing, whenever the territorial investigators schedule it. That could be months away, I know. But when it happens, I want to be there. In the room, she met his eyes. I want the people in that town to see me standing in a room where what happened in October is being undone. Not for myself, or not only for myself. For every person Finch did this to who didn't have what we had. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. We'll go, he said. Whenever it is. She nodded. Outside, the ridge was fully green now, the way it only got for 6 weeks of the year, when the weather cooperated and the grass came in thick, and the water ran clear in the creek. The horses were in the upper pasture, Pockets still investigating pockets whenever anyone got close enough. Cattle were settled. The south fence was solid along its full length. Every post she and Gideon had worked through winter, confirmed and documented in the county record. In a lockbox in the bedroom, she had moved it from the tack room months ago, double-wrapped in oilcloth. Exactly as she'd told him to were 7 years of tax receipts, and an original deed with clean survey markers, and a copy of a Denver lawyer's assessment that had, when it needed to, changed the outcome of something that had seemed inevitable. She thought about the woman who had walked into a church 8 months ago in a good dress, with a bag already packed, and a folding knife from an uncle who'd never asked for it back, who had stood in front of a congregation that found her humiliation entertaining and said, in a shaking voice, "I am not property." She thought about the woman who had stood in a yard with a rifle while 7 men on horses decided whether to push through. She had not become a different person. That was the thing she kept arriving at, the thing she kept finding to be true. She had not been remade or transformed or discovered some new version of herself she hadn't known existed. She had just been given through the strangest and most improbable series of events she could have imagined the conditions in which the person she had always been could actually function. Space, enough of it. And beside her, a man who understood that what you build matters more than what you're told you are. Across the table, Gideon was looking at the window. His jaw had lost the tight set it had carried since April. His hands on the table were relaxed, in a way she'd noticed only in the last few weeks, the specific unclenching of a man who has stopped bracing for the next thing. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "When the investigation is done," she said, "when it's all finished and whatever's going to happen has happened, I want to think about the house." "What about it?" "The east room," she said. There was a room off the east side of the main house that Gideon used for storage tools, extra rope, the accumulation of a man who'd lived alone for years. "I want to clear it out." He was quiet. "Not for us," she said, because she wanted to be clear. "I've been thinking about it for months. There are children in this county whose situations are, I know what it is to be considered surplus, to be the person in a room that everyone is waiting to become someone else's problem." She paused. "I want to think about whether there's something we can do about that. In a real way. Not charity, not something real. Somewhere that functions." He held her gaze across the table for a long moment. "The east room," he said. "To start," she said. "It would need more than that eventually, if it worked." "It'd need a lot," he said. "Time. Money. A woman who doesn't know the meaning of leaving a thing half done." She looked at him. "Good thing we have one," he said. Closest thing to a joke she had ever heard from him. And it was dry and delivered with a completely straight face, and she laughed a real laugh, not performed, kind that happens before you decide to do it. And his face moved into something that was not quite a smile, but was the expression he had when he was satisfied about something. Outside, the summer light lay long and golden over Whisper Ridge, over the pastures and the creek and the solid stone house that he had built with 2 years of work alongside everything else, that had held against a hard winter and 7 riders, and the slow grinding pressure of a man who had thought he was dealing with people who had nowhere to turn. He had miscalculated. He had miscalculated, because he had seen a woman pulled to the front of a church by her wrist and concluded that what he was looking at was a woman without resources. He had not looked carefully enough. He had not considered what 8 months of actual life, hard and cold and real, alongside a man who worked beside rather than above, might produce in a woman who had always had the capacity and had never been given the conditions. He would not make that mistake again. But that was his problem to carry, not hers. Hers was the East Room, and what it might become, and the territorial hearing when it came, and the kitchen garden that was producing more than she'd expected and needed preserving before August, and the mere pocket who was going to need a shoe replaced before the week was out, and the man across the table who was looking at her with the expression she had finally stopped, trying to talk herself out of reading correctly. There was enough work here for a lifetime. She found, sitting in the afternoon light of the house on Whisper Ridge, that she was not afraid of that. The territorial investigation took 11 months. Clementine had known it would take time. Hargrove had said months, maybe a year, but knowing a thing abstractly and living inside it are different experiences. The investigation was a presence on the ridge. The way winter was a presence. You couldn't see it directly, but you could feel its weight in the way conversations moved and the way certain decisions waited. They did not wait passively. That was not how either of them was built. East Room was cleared by August. It took 3 days Gideon hauling the accumulated years of solo, living out to the barn, reorganizing, making space with the same methodical care he brought to everything structural. Clementine whitewashed the walls herself, which was not a skill she'd had in October and was a reasonable skill by the following July. And she put in 2 narrow beds with proper frames Gideon built from leftover pine and a small table and a window that faced east and got the morning light first. She had told him it would need more than the East Room eventually. She had underestimated her own underestimation. The first child came in September, before the room was fully finished. A boy named Eli, 8 years old, delivered by Tom Alderman's wife, who had found him sleeping in the alderman's barn for 3 nights, and who arrived at the ridge with him on the back of her horse and an expression that said she knew this was not a small thing to ask, but was asking it anyway. His mother passed in July. Martha Alderman said, "Father's not the father is not able." Clementine looked at Eli. He was thin in the way children get thin when no one has been paying attention to whether they're eating. He had the specific stillness of a child who has learned that drawing attention to himself is usually a mistake. He was holding the strap of a canvas bag that was too small to contain much of anything useful. She had met that stillness before. She had practiced it herself for 26 years. "Come inside," she said. "I made biscuits this morning." He looked at her with the particular assessment of a child who has been disappointed enough times to be careful about hope. Then he looked at the biscuits on the kitchen table through the open door. "All right," he said. He stayed. That was not a decision made. In one moment it was made, across a series of days in which Eli tested the edges of the situation the way all displaced children test edges, looking for the point where the patience ran out, where the welcome became conditional. Gideon handled this with a kind of steady, unhurried consistency that Clementine could not have predicted, but should have. She thought he was. After all, a man who had spent years in isolated conditions, where panic was a luxury, and steadiness was the only workable tool. He gave Eli tasks. Not charity tasks, not invented busy work real tasks, things that needed doing, with real consequences if they weren't done, and real acknowledgement when they were. The water troughs, the chicken feed, specific sections of fence to walk and report on. By October, Eli was telling the horses which one was his and which one was not, with the authority of someone establishing a fact rather than expressing a preference. His horse, apparently, was Pocket. Pocket tolerated this. The second child was a girl, Clara, which Gideon took in without comment, though Clementine watched his face when he heard the name 11 years old, from a family in the valley that had lost everything to a combination of drought and a bad loan, and had fractured under the pressure the way families fracture when the strain exceeds their structure. Her mother had written to Martha Alderman because Martha Alderman was the person in the valley that women in trouble wrote to, and Martha had written to Clementine. Clara was not quiet. She was, in fact, the loudest human presence the Ridge had encountered, with opinions about everything and a tendency to express them without previewing whether the room wanted them. She argued with Eli, bossed the chickens, asked Gideon questions he didn't always know how to answer, and had, by the end of her first week, reorganized Clementine's kitchen garden by some logic of her own that turned out, infuriatingly, to work better than the original arrangement. Clementine looked at the rearranged garden and looked at Clara. "That's better," she said. Clara shrugged with the elaborate nonchalance of a child, pretending she hadn't desperately needed to be told that. The tall ones were shading the small ones. "I know. I should have seen it. You have a lot to do," Clara said in the tone of someone issuing a magnanimous absolution. Clementine did not smile, not while Clara was looking. The East Room had 2 children in it now, and the arrangement was not always quiet and was never simple. And she would not have described the fall of that year as peaceful, exactly. But it had a quality she could only think of as density, the sense of a life that contained enough, that was full in the way a well-built thing is full, without gaps where the wind got in. Territorial investigators came to Oakhaven for the formal hearing on the 14th of May, nearly 11 months after they had first arrived, nearly 13 months after the June hearing at Beecham's office, and 19 months after the Sunday in October, when Jeremiah Finch had set a leather satchel on a church pulpit and changed everything. Clementine rode down the mountain with Gideon on the 13th, staying the night in Oakhaven for the first time since October of '78. Martha Alderman watched Eli and Clara, a fact that Eli was slightly insulted by. He was nearly 10 now. He considered himself essentially an adult, and that Clara was delighted by because Martha Alderman had agreed to teach her to make pie crust, and Clara had been campaigning for this for 2 months. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, not the land office, which was a statement in itself a scope about the scope of what had been found. It was a larger room, and it had more people in it, territorial officers, the 2 investigators, a court recorder, witnesses who had been summoned, and witnesses who had arrived voluntarily. Sam Hargrove had made the trip from Denver himself, which Clementine had not expected, and which moved her in a way she didn't entirely account for, until she saw him a small, precise man in his 60s with a careful handshake, and understood that he had come because he wanted to see how it ended. She understood that. She was here for the same reason. Jeremiah Finch sat at a table with 2 lawyers, and the specific quality of a man who has decided that composure is his only remaining asset and is spending it carefully. He looked at Clementine once when she entered. She looked back at him with nothing in her expression that he could use no triumph, no anger, not even the satisfaction she actually felt, which was real, but which was also hers and not for him. He looked away first. Edmund Pruitt was not present. He had, according to Hargrove's most recent letter, relocated to Utah Territory sometime in the previous winter. The investigators had submitted his amended surveys as evidence, without his testimony, which they were able to do because the documentary record the identical language. The professional assessments, the comparison across 3 counties was sufficient without him. The hearing took 4 hours. The investigators had found 9 properties in 2 counties where Finch's land trust had acquired land through fraudulent survey manipulations over a 6-year period. 9 families. Some of them had sold under pressure. Some had had claims adjudicated against them in county hearings with incomplete information. 2 had lost properties they'd held for over a decade. The record was read into the official transcript. Each property, each family, each transaction. Clementine sat and listened to all 9. She thought about what it would have been to be any one of those 9 families without the particular combination of things she and Gideon had managed to assemble a Denver lawyer, with the right contacts, neighbors willing to sign statements, the prior Fremont County evidence, the time and the stubbornness to prepare for 2 months before walking into a hearing room. Most people didn't have that. Most people faced what those 9 families faced with what they had on hand, which was usually less than enough. The investigators recommended territorial sanctions against the Oakhaven Territorial Land Trust and its registered officers, which included Finch and 2 associates. They recommended referral to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal proceedings related to fraudulent land acquisition. They recommended that 5 of the 9 affected properties be reviewed for potential restitution of title. Restitution of title. The language was careful and bureaucratic, and it meant some of those families might get their land back. Finch's lawyer entered objections. They were entered and noted, and the hearing continued. When it was over, Hargrove found Clementine and Gideon in the corridor outside. The Attorney General referral is the significant piece, he said. The territorial sanctions limit his ability to operate formally. But if the Attorney General pursues the criminal referral and given the documented pattern, I believe they will. That's the thing that changes the county permanently. How long? Gideon asked. Another year, probably. These things move on their own schedule. Hargrove looked at Clementine. The 5 properties up for title review, I'd like to reach out to those families on your behalf. The documentation you assembled is the basis of that review. Should know that. She thought about that. About 5 families who did not know that a woman they'd never met had spent a year building a paper case that was now the foundation of the review that might return their land to them. Let me write the letters, she said. I'd rather they come from me directly, not from a lawyer's office. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Outside the courthouse, Oakhaven was doing what it always did, moving through a Tuesday with the ordinary commerce of a working town. The street was not empty. People passed. Some of them recognized Clementine and Gideon. Some of them didn't. Mrs. Hargrove came out of the millinery, across the street, and stopped on the boardwalk. She looked at Clementine. Clementine looked at her. Mrs. Hargrove gave a small nod, short, awkward, the nod of a woman who knows she owes something she doesn't entirely know how to pay. Clementine returned it. Even. Not warm, not cold, just acknowledging. That was enough. She was not here to collect anything from these people. She had not come to Oakhaven for the satisfaction of being seen to win. Or, if she had, she'd outgrown that motive somewhere in the past 11 months of actual work. Come for was simpler, to be in the room when the record was set straight, to be a witness to the correction. She had been a witness. That was done. Ready? Gideon said beside her. Yes, she said. They rode back up the mountain. She wrote the 5 letters over 2 evenings, at the kitchen table, while Eli did his reading at the other end, and Clara argued softly with herself over a piece of needlework she'd started to learn and was finding more resistant than expected. The lamp burned. The fire was low. It was May now, and the evening still needed something, but not much. The letters were not long. She had learned, over the past year and a half, that the most precise letters were the shorter ones, that length was often a form of anxiety, the writer trying to preemptively answer every possible objection, and that what people in difficult circumstances actually needed was clear information and a direct point of contact. She told each family what had been found. She told them what the title review meant in practical terms. She told them there were no guarantees and that the process would take time. She told them that Sam Hargrove in Denver had agreed to correspond with them at no initial cost if they had questions about their specific situations. And she told each of them, because she wanted, it said plainly, without ceremony, that the documentation behind the investigation had come from a case that started on a single property on Whisper Ridge. That one contested hearing, with the right evidence, had opened a record that eventually covered the full 6 years of Finch's operation. She wrote, "It is worth fighting the thing directly in front of you, even when you cannot yet see how far the consequences reach." She sealed the letters and gave them to Holt on his next supply run, and that was that. She could not control what those families did with the information, or how the title reviews came out, or how long the Attorney General took, or any of the other moving pieces of a process she'd helped set in motion, but did not control. She had made her peace with that distinction a long time ago. Setting things in motion was enough. You did the work that was yours to do, and then you let the work do what it would. The summer Eli turned 10, the summer of 1888, third child arrived on the ridge. This one came differently. Not through Martha Alderman, not through a letter. He arrived on foot, on a Tuesday morning in July, walking up the lower road with a split lip and a cut above his eye, and the specific determination of someone who has decided that wherever he's going has to be better than where he came from. His name was Thomas. He was 12. He had heard from someone in the valley who had heard it from someone else that there was a place up on Whisper Ridge. Heard there was a place, he said, standing in the yard, bleeding in a moderate but not alarming way. Kids who don't have anywhere. Clementine looked at him for a long moment. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Man in the valley. Name of Alderman." She was going to have words with Tom Alderman about what exactly he was advertising on her behalf, and to whom. She also understood, standing in the yard looking at a 12-year-old with a split lip who had walked 3 miles uphill, because someone had told him there was a place, that the words she had with Tom Alderman were not going to change the fundamental reality of what Whisper Ridge had become. "Come inside," she said. "We'll deal with your face first." "Is it bad?" "The lip's not serious. The cut above your eye needs cleaning." She held the door. "You ever done barn work?" He blinked at the change of subject. "Some." "Good. We need the north stall rebedded, and Eli's been avoiding it for 2 days. She called into the house, "Eli, come introduce yourself." Eli appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a 10-year-old who suspects he is about to be assigned a task he will not enjoy. "This is Thomas," Clementine said. "Show him where the barn tools are, and then explain why you haven't done the north stall." "Going to do it tomorrow," Eli said. "You were going to do it today," she said. "Go." Eli sized up Thomas with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a child evaluating whether a new person represents a threat or an ally. Thomas sized him back. Some kind of silent agreement was apparently reached, because Eli stepped off the porch and jerked his head in the direction of the barn. "Come on," he said. "The north stall is terrible." "Great," Thomas said, and followed him. Clementine stood in the doorway and watched them go. She thought, in the years that followed, about what it would have taken to explain Whisper Ridge to someone who hadn't seen it grow. East Room had become 2 rooms by 1,881. With a small addition, Gideon built in the late fall, not elegantly, not on the first attempt, but solidly, the way everything he built was solid. There were, at various points over those years, between 2 and 5 children on the property, in arrangements that were never entirely the same twice, and were never without friction, and were never what anyone would have called smooth. Smooth was not the word for a household containing multiple children who had come from difficult places and were still, each in their own way and on their own schedule, deciding whether trust was a reasonable investment. There were arguments. There were nights when something broke, not always a physical thing, and had to be worked through the following morning without the benefit of resolution having come on its own overnight. There were children who stayed for years, and children who stayed for months and moved on to something that fit them better. There was a girl named Ruth who arrived at 13 and left at 16 to apprentice with a seamstress in Millhaven and wrote letters back for years, and a boy named James who was with them for 2 winters and then returned to his father, who had, in that time, become someone his son could live with again. None of it was neat. Clementine would not have trusted it if it were. What it was, underneath the disorder, was functional. The ranch operated. The cattle were managed. The kitchen garden, Clara's garden now. Clara, who had stayed, and who would turn 17 in the fall, and who had been running the food production of the property with the confidence of someone who had never once been told. She wasn't capable of it, produced more than they needed, and the surplus went to the aldermans, and the aldermans sent other things back. And this was the texture of a life embedded in community rather than standing apart from it. Gideon moved through it all the way. He moved through everything steadily, without theater, present in the specific way of someone who has decided that showing up every day is not the consolation prize, but the actual point. He was not a man who found the noise of children easy. She knew that, had watched him in the early months, work through his own adjustment to the loss of the particular silence he'd lived in for 4 years. But he was a man who understood that things worth having were worth the discomfort of having them. And he had made his decision about Whisper Ridge and what it was becoming with the same settled conviction he'd made every other decision she'd witnessed. She loved him for many things, but she loved him most for that, for the consistency of it, for the fact that she had never once, in all the years since that October wagon ride up the mountain, caught him being a different person depending on who was watching. He was the same man in the barn as he was at the table, the same man with Eli as he was with the territorial investigators, same man in the bad months, and there were bad months, because the ranch had years where it ran close, and years where the weather was punishing, and years where something broke expensively as he was in the good ones. She had not known, before Gideon Hayes, that consistency in a person was a form of love. She had thought love was an event, a feeling, something that arrived and announced itself. She had learned slowly, across the small daily repetitions of a shared life, that it was mostly just showing up the same way, over and over, until the person beside you can stop spending energy wondering who you're going to be today. The Attorney General's proceedings against Finch concluded in the late fall of 1881, 3 years after the Sunday in the church. Criminal referral had resulted in charges of fraudulent land acquisition and conspiracy to defraud, prosecuted at the territorial level. Finch had fought it for 2 years with every legal resource available to him, which were considerable, and the outcome was accordingly not the clean, decisive thing that satisfying conclusions are supposed to be. He was not imprisoned. Clementine had come to terms with this possibility well before it became reality. Hargrove had been honest with her about the limitations of territorial criminal proceedings against a well-resourced defendant with competent lawyers. What happened instead was a combination of financial penalties, a formal prohibition on operating land acquisition entities in the territory, and the permanent revocation of the Oak Haven Territorial Land Trust's operating status. 3 of the 5 properties under review had their titles restored to the original owners. The other 2 had changed hands too many times through legitimate subsequent sales to untangle cleanly, and those families received financial settlements that were, Hargrove said, not adequate, but were something. Not adequate, but something. That was a phrase she wrote down, because it was an honest description of how most of the world's wrongs resolved when they resolved at all, and she thought it was worth remembering rather than polishing into something more satisfying than it was. Finch left Oak Haven in the winter of 1881. She didn't know where he went. She didn't follow it. What she knew was that on a cold December morning, she rode into Oak Haven for supplies, and the bank on the main street had a new name on the sign and a different man behind the counter, and the valley felt in some way she couldn't have defended with specific evidence, different, lighter. The way a room feels when something heavy has been in it for a long time and is finally gone. She turned 33 the spring of 1885, which she knew because Eli, who was 15 and had decided that birthdays were important, in a way that she suspected was connected to the fact that his own had never been marked before he came to. The Ridge made a point of telling her at breakfast. 33, he said, with the thoughtful gravity of a 15-year-old working through the implications of an age. Yes, she said. That's not very old, he said, which was either consoling or analytical. With Eli, it was hard to tell. Thank you, she said. Clara, 20, and no longer lived in the East Room, but in a proper addition on the west side of the house that had been built, partly because she'd outgrown the East Room, and partly because she'd shown no indication of going anywhere, and they'd all tacitly agreed to stop pretending she might, came in with coffee and a piece of cornbread she'd made specifically for the occasion which was the kind of gesture Clara made practical and warm and slightly aggressive in its warmth, as if she dared you to find it sentimental. Clementine ate the cornbread at a table that had 3 people at it in the morning, and sometimes more, and occasionally had the kind of conversation that required everyone to raise their voice, and occasionally has a silence so comfortable it didn't need filling. And she thought about a woman she had been at 26, sitting in a church pew in a good dress, with her hands folded in her lap. She had not known then what she was capable of. Not because the capacity wasn't there. She understood now that it had always been there, that it had been there in the form of a folding knife from an uncle who never asked for it back, and a bag that was always half-packed, and the instinct to say, "I am not property," in a shaking voice in a room full of people who were laughing. It had been there. It had just needed conditions. That was the thing she wished she could say to the woman in the pew. Not that it would get better in some vague eventual way. Not that she would find something inside herself she didn't know was there. Specifically, practically, you need conditions. You need to find the conditions, or build them, or marry into them. When a strange man sets a pouch of gold on a pulpit and asks you a direct question, and you say, "All right," the conditions aren't perfection, they're not safety, exactly, or ease. They're just enough space. Enough space to find out what you actually are when no one is spending energy telling you what you're not. She had spent the better part of a decade building that space into something real on a mountain in Colorado territory, and it had cost her everything she hadn't needed and nothing she had. Gideon found her on the porch that evening, which was where she went when she needed to think, and which he knew, and which was why he came there rather than anywhere else when he wanted to find her. He sat beside her on the top step. The light was doing the thing it did on clear May evenings at elevation, going gold and long across the upper pasture, making the grass look like something out of a painting, except that no painter had ever quite gotten the quality of it right, because the quality of it required being cold while you looked at it. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. They sat for a while. Below the ridge, through the tree line, she could hear the creek. Above it, somewhere in the upper pasture, one of the horses' pocket, probably who was old now and moved slower but was otherwise unchanged, in her relentless investigation of coat pockets, made a sound of mild complaint about something. In the house behind them, she could hear Clara and Eli in a conversation that had the rhythmic escalation of an argument that both parties were enjoying more than the content. "Thomas wrote," she said. Thomas, who had arrived with a split lip in the summer of 1880, had left the ridge at 17 to work a freight route north, and had been sending letters back at irregular intervals for the past 3 years. The letters were short and factual, and occasionally funny, which was precisely how Thomas communicated in person, and was therefore, she thought, a good sign. What did he say? "He's got a partner on the freight route, man named Calloway. Says they're thinking about buying a wagon of their own instead of contracting." She paused. He asked if Eli wanted to come work with them this summer. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What does Eli want?" "I haven't told him yet, but I know what he wants." She looked at the pasture. "He wants to go. He's been wanting something that's his own for a year now. He's 15. It's the right time to want it. Will you let him?" She thought about the woman at 26 who had never left Oakhaven, who had packed a bag she never got to use for years. "Yes," she said. "Of course." Gideon nodded. They sat with the evening for a while longer. There was something she had been thinking about since Hargrove's last letter, which had contained, along with the final documentation of the Finch proceedings, personal note, the first personal note in years of formal correspondence, asking how the ranch was and how the children were, and saying, the slightly awkward warmth of a man who expressed himself better in legal briefs than in ordinary sentences, that the Whisper Ridge case had been the most satisfying work of his career. She had read that and thought, he's saying something true. And so is this. And so was the day. Eli told her she didn't look old, and the day Clara reorganized the garden, and the morning she found Thomas walking up the lower road. What she had built here was not a monument to what she'd survived. It was not a vindication story, not a. You were wrong about me delivered to an audience. Those were satisfying thoughts, but they were not what the actual life was made of. The actual life was made of biscuits on a kitchen table and fence posts and snowdrifts and letters that needed writing, and children who tested edges and horses who were old and complained about it, and a man beside her on a porch step who had not once, in 7 years, been a different person depending on who was watching. "What are you thinking?" Gideon said. She considered it. "That we got it right," she said, "not perfectly, but right." He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, the east room could use another coat of whitewash before fall. "I know. And the south fence I know," he said. "And Eli is going to be dramatic about Thomas's letter." "He's 15, Gideon said. "He's dramatic about everything." She almost smiled. Above them, the stars were starting to come in over the peaks, the way they always did, not all at once but one at a time, as if each one needed to be sure of its welcome before committing. Below, the creek ran. The house held its warmth against the cooling night. Inside, Clara and Eli's argument had resolved into laughter, which was how most arguments on Whisper Ridge resolved, eventually. Thought about the last thing her mother had told her. The thing about the only opinion worth trusting being the one built from what you'd actually done. She had been carrying that for 11 years, by the time she sat in that church pew, carrying it as a thing she believed in theory, but had never had enough room to test. She had tested it now, thoroughly. What she had actually done, with her actual hands. On actual days, she had held a rifle steady in a yard. She had sewn a man's leg closed in lamplight. She had written letters that reached people she'd never met and changed what was possible for them. She had whitewashed a room and put beds in it and said, "Come inside," to children who were calculating whether hope was worth the risk. She had stood in a church and said, "I am not property," in a voice that shook. And she had sat in a hearing room and laid evidence on a table in a voice that did not, and both of those women were the same woman, which was what mattered. The mountain held around her the way it had always held, large and cold and indifferent to human drama, did the Guindo, which was its best quality. It did not care what Jeremiah Finch had thought she was. It did not care what Oakhaven had thought. It only responded to what you actually did on it, day after day, in the weather that came whether you were ready or not. She had been doing that for 7 years now. She would keep doing it tomorrow. Gideon's shoulder was against hers on the porch. Step not dramatically, not deliberately. Just there, the way it was every evening when they sat like this. She didn't move away from it. The stars kept coming in. Creek kept running. And on Whisper Ridge, in the high country of Colorado Territory, in a house built by a man who had cared about it and tended by a woman who had claimed it as entirely her own, the lamps burned steady and the walls held, and the night came down quiet and complete over everything they had made.